Okay, hi, this is Paul Cockshott here. I've been asked by Finball to give a talk. He left it open what topic to cover. Suggested either something on why bourgeois economics is wrong or something on market socialism and why market socialism has limitations or reasons to be skeptical of it. And because I've put up lots of videos already on what's wrong with bourgeois economics, I decided what I'd do was the market socialism one, as I haven't produced much in the way of actual talks on market socialism. So the talk's called Limits of Market Socialism. And if you want to be following it on slides, I'm moving on to slide 2. And basically, the summary of my talk is that I'm going to be dealing with the role that the ideology of market socialism played in the collapse of hitherto existing socialism. Then I'm going to go on to a somewhat technical argument about its effect on wealth distribution, mention a bit about unemployment, and at the end I'll finish on the limited positive role that markets have under socialism, in terms of consumer goods markets and in terms of transitional measures when shifting from a capitalist economy to a socialist economy or a communist economy. Now, let's focus on the ideological role, because that is quite critical to follow what happened from the 1960s through to the late 1980s in the existing Soviet bloc. A socialist bloc. During the 1960s to the mid-80s in Eastern Europe, market socialism was initially presented as a reform of the existing socialist system. The claim was being made that the advocates of market socialism just wanted a better socialism. They wanted one that was more responsive to consumer demand, and also, if you take the case of the people from Yugoslavia, they wanted one which would give more autonomy to workers at individual factories. Now, that was how it was presented initially. Now, when you look at the concrete aims or the concrete demands, there was a gradual escalation of them. One of the first objectives was to allow enterprises to return more of their turnover. And it was said that this would lead to greater efficiency because it would give incentives to factory managers to operate efficiently if the enterprise was able to hold more of its turnover. Now, obviously, behind that, there's a distributional issue. There's an issue of, is the state able to actually appropriate the product produced in its factories, or does the product to some extent become the private property, at least of the enterprise, and possibly of the managers in the enterprise? Another goal was to allow some flexibility in the setting of prices, and this argument for flexibility of the setting of prices has some credibility, because often the administered prices were essentially could be quite far removed from prices that are proportional to values. The law of value was not closely followed, in the sense that when I use the term law of value here, I mean they were not closely following the principle that the selling price of goods to consumers should be proportional to the labour time incorporated in them. They roughly followed this, but not as closely as might be the case, and in certain critical goods or classes of goods there was quite significant deviations of prices from values. And this could be presented as a failure to meet market needs or market demand. So that when talking about the law of value in the Soviet bloc, there was a confusion between, do you mean the accurate representation of embodied labour time, or by the law of value, do you mean just a shorthand way of saying determination of price by supply and demand? In a sense, some people talking of the law of value were using it as a way of incorporating basically neoclassical ideas about price. It was also argued that market socialism would allow the formation of worker co-ops, and this is a theme which you also get fairly widely in the West among anarchist currents or syndicalist currents. And if you look at the initial reforms by Gorbachev, he allowed the formation of workers' co-ops, but at that stage still said that the private employment of wage labour should be prohibited, i.e. it was still seen as something exploitative and something which shouldn't be permitted. So at this stage it's still within the realms of socialism in that it is seeking to make sure that there is no income from exploitation, income from the exploitation of labour power. I'm now on to number 7. The effects of this, though, once it started to be put in, were to rehabilitate liberal economics, rehabilitate ideas from Western economic studies, and it created general license to criticise and rubbish socialist ideology. And you also got, in the USSR certainly, the growth of a plethora of small businesses who were exploiting what were nominally co-ops in order to set up what were really capitalist businesses, and they were co-ops in name only. And this established a new private bourgeois class, a class of private business managers. The effect of the other demand for the retention of more turnover by state enterprises was to generate a shortage of state revenue. You have to realise that in the USSR, a substantial part of the total state revenue came from the profits that were being made by state factories, which were handed over to the government and could then be used to finance social services, finance defence, finance research and development, etc. So these had been a key part of state revenue, and if you just ceding to the demands of the pro-market sector of the managerial class, allow the local managers to have a larger share of that, obviously a smaller share goes to the state. And unless at the same time some alternative system of taxation had been introduced, the inevitable effect is you get a state budget deficit, and you had the printing of money to cover the government spending, you got rapid inflation, you got growing shortages. So all of these were direct economic effects during the Gorbachev period of putting into practice the demands of the market socialists. So we're on page 10 now, and particularly as a result of the inflation and shortages, you've got a growing social crisis and stormy class struggles taking place. And we know what happened in the end. It was the wreck of the state in the Soviet case. Now we know it doesn't necessarily lead to the wreck of the state, because in the Yugoslav case you had market socialist measures introduced 30 years earlier, or more than 30 years earlier, maybe 35 years earlier, and this didn't lead immediately to the wreck of the socialist state in Yugoslavia. The socialist state in Yugoslavia didn't actually collapse until after the Soviet bloc started to collapse. But in the Soviet case, on page 11 now, the effect was the eventual drowning of socialism. There was you had a rapid shift to a capitalist economy, mass mortality in the working class, particularly among males and particularly among manual workers. You had unemployment, you had hunger, you had around 12 million excess deaths in the 20 years which followed the transition to capitalism. About 12 million excess deaths in Russia alone. That's not counting the excess deaths in the Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, etc. Now, why did all this happen? Let's for a moment ignore the political overdetermination. The fact that the demands for market socialism in the USSR were overdetermined by a struggle between Marxism and Western economic ideology, and overdetermined by class contradictions between the working class and the intelligentsia. Let's put that aside and assume you start off with something which is of not of that character, something more like what happened in Yugoslavia. We have to say, why is market socialism an unstable mix? Why is it likely to get blown onto the rocks? I'm on number 14 now. If you look at what Lenin was saying in the early stages of the NEP, he's making concessions towards the market at that point. But he also says that the market economy constantly at 1,000 places gives rise to capitalist relations. And he knew this from his very early work, the development of capitalism in Russia. His work on the transition to capitalism in the Russian countryside, which was his first major theoretical work. And he knew it on sociological grounds, that you got a different, where you had market relations penetrating into the countryside, you had a differentiation of the peasantry into those who were richer and could employ labour, and those who were poorer and had to work for others, and you got the gradual formation of capitalist relations in the countryside, and which, in the development of capitalism in Russia, he was basically saying this is irreversible. Now, we now know that there are deep statistical reasons for this, and we know it because of another Russian, Viktor Yakovenko, who in the 90s, I think it was, wrote a very important article, The Statistical Mechanics of Money. And he was able to show that what Lenin had just observed as an empirical fact is a necessary consequence of monetary economic relations. He's a theoretical physicist, or solid state physicist. And Yakovenko found he's a physicist, but being a Russian who did his university education during the Soviet period, the only economics he had learned was Marx's Capital. Now, he found that there was a deep correspondence between commodity traders or owners of commodities and molecules in a gas, and there's a deep correspondence between the money held by commodity traders and the energy of molecules in a gas. Now, in a certain sense, you can immediately see that there is a relationship, at least, in that market economies are chaotic, disorganized systems. They're also systems with very large numbers of agents, individuals and firms. So they're they must have bulk statistics, bulk statistical properties. The question is, what are the laws which govern this? Now, in a gas, you've got molecules buzzing around and they keep bumping into one another. And when they collide, there's an exchange of energy between the molecules. But this exchange is governed by conservation laws. But at a similar level, whenever a commodity transaction takes place, someone buys something for money, whether it's an employer buying labour power, or you buying something in the shop, or one firm selling something to another. If you just consider the money and ignore the commodity that moves, just consider the circulation of money, these are random interactions in which money is exchanged, or money is transferred rather. Just as in molecular collisions, you have random interactions in which energy is transferred. But in both cases there's a conservation law. The quantity of energy or the quantity of money is conserved. And this imposes on both of them the same sort of aggregate statistics. Now, can I suggest you all go to slide 20, because if you can, there is a video which you should be able to watch there. If you click on that slide, there is a start icon for the start of a video. If you click on it, you will see an animation of what happens to 500,000 agents, each of whom start off with the same amount of money. As it evolves, you see that a direct distribution, sorry, I'll go right back to the start. Go back to here. A direct distribution is one where everyone is the same. And that rapidly develops towards a Gaussian or normal distribution of money, that's fair enough. And the normal distribution spreads out until the left-hand side of it reaches zero. And that's people with no money at all. And as you observe it over time, you see the number of people with no money at all grows. And on the other side, you get a few people with a lot of money. The longer you run it, just a simulation, what's going on behind the scenes in generating this was a simulation of 500,000 agents interacting, each making small transactions between one another. And as it runs on, we'll move on to slide 21. You end up with a distribution of money among the agents which very closely fits the red line. And the red line is what's known as the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution, which is the law which governs energy in a gas, on the molecules of a gas. So it shows from simulation that you would expect money held by agents to follow the same law as energy of molecules in a gas. You get lots of people with almost no money and a small number of people with a lot of money. And this is just due to the random interaction that is taking place. And both in the gas and in an economy, this is the result of the law of increasing entropy. If you look at the bottom side of the animation, you can see the entropy of the distribution, and it rises towards a plateau and stabilizes at a maximal entropy state. And the maximum entropy state is the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. In his original paper, he has slides which I reproduce here on sheet 22 of what the actual empirical distribution of money holdings in the United States are. And they fit almost exactly to this Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. So he starts off from a purely theoretical argument about the nature of conservation laws and chaotic systems, predicts a distribution, observes that's what actually happens in a real capitalist economy. So why is this relevant for market socialism? Suppose you start with a set of co-ops and individual producers, and they're all equal at the beginning. The law of increasing entropy means that over time, the money that these co-ops or individual artists' hands will have will end up highly uneven. Even if it started off even, it'll become uneven as a result of random processes. A few co-ops will end up with a lot of money, and many will have very little. Many will be effectively bankrupt in these terms. This means you get the creation of a reserve army of labour. A market economy, including one made of co-ops, has no guarantee that it'll operate at full employment. This was theoretically demonstrated by Kleski and Keynes in the 30s, obviously assumed by Marx, but people talking about market socialism tend to overlook this. They just assume there'll be full employment. There won't. And when you couple the existence of a reserve army of labour with the differentiation of co-ops, what's going to happen? Some people are going to migrate. Yugoslavia had a chronic labour migration problem of people migrating to Germany, which the Titoist government was willing to put up with because it reduced the level of visible unemployment in Yugoslavia. But the fact that this reserve army of labour existed and that this emigration was taking place indicates that the market socialist economy did not automatically work at a level which would ensure full employment. Now, if you don't have the option of forcing the unemployed to emigrate, the pressure to allow the employment of workers from the bankrupt co-ops by other co-ops under what would amount to wage labour is going to be huge. Even if it's not going to be overt wage labour, it could be something like labour-only subcontracting. The effect would be the same. Some co-ops which had lots of cash would end up effectively employing the workers from the co-ops with no cash. And once wage labour is introduced, then the differentiation of income becomes much more extreme. Up until now, the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution just deals with the differentiation of income due to random statistical fluctuations. Once wage labour is involved, you get a new mechanism. And both Yakovenko and Ian Wright, with whom I was one of the co-authors of Classical Econophysics, show that when this happens, you get the formation of a class of super-rich. Just the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution would never end up with anyone as rich as Warren Buffett or Bill Gates. But once you allow the exploitation of labour power, you get a new distribution for the super-rich. You get a distribution which is a power law distribution rather than a negative exponential distribution, which allows people to become much richer. And then essentially you have a capitalist economy. Socialism's back on the rocks. However, I'm now on number 26. Market socialism is feasible as a transitional measure. In fact, in some sense, it's almost unavoidable as a transitional measure. Before you have a comprehensive planning system, before that has been established, some form of markets are going to be inevitable. The question is, what form of markets should a communist government aim for? In my view, you should aim for the transfer of all private enterprises into worker co-ops immediately. A transfer to a Yugoslavic type economy straight away before you have the ability to plan everything. Because the first task is to put all the surplus under the control of the working class. Even if it's in the hands of small groups of workers, it takes it out of the hands of the bourgeoisie. So market co-ops are market socialism in the form of mass cooperatives is an immediate measure that can be taken and is a progressive measure in the context of an already existing capitalist economy. But to prevent the atomization and competition and random differentiation of income that I described earlier, you immediately have to try and bring all the co-ops together into some super co-op level structure. I think there's a lot to be said for the de-Leonist program in this sense, that the first step after establishing the co-ops is to establish syndicates based perhaps on the existing trade unions. So you'd have a dairy workers syndicate which managed all the factories producing yogurt, cheese, etc. An automobile workers syndicate which managed all the car factories which had previously been owned by a variety of different private companies, etc. Transport workers syndicate that would unify the land transport by road and by rail to prevent the competition between them. Once you've got that, you're in a position in parallel with this to introduce social planning, have calculation in kind for these syndicates, and once you have that going, then you can abolish money. You can't do it so long as the actual supply of goods to the individual syndicates depends on them being able to purchase from other syndicates. Let's assume that's been done. What do you have left? Well, what you have left is just a sort of pseudo-market under communism. In the first stage of communism, what Marx describes as the continued existence of bourgeois right. It's not based on money at this stage. It's based on labour credits, and it only works in the consumer goods sector. I'm on slide 30. As I say, it's restricted to consumption goods. Doesn't apply to means of production because these are allocated between the syndicates by plan, between the freely associated producers, as Marx puts it. And there are no private sales. Sales of consumer goods occur only through the cooperative shops or through the state shops, so that private business is eliminated in part because as Marx says, the labour credits are no more money than a theatre ticket. They're cancelled out as soon as they're given up at a state factory or state warehouse. So that is, I don't know how long I've been talking. That's the end of my planned talk at 40 minutes. That's longer than I expected. So I'm ready for questions now.
You mentioned that if you had a market socialist system where you would basically end up with richer co-ops employing or exploiting people from bankrupt co-ops, is there any empirical or historical precedent? Did that actually happen in Yugoslavia, for example? Do you know?
In Yugoslavia, it took the form of a strong polarization of income across regions. Okay, so you got some regions, some republics had more successful co-ops than others, and this then, well, this then led to the demands by the the regions with a lot of better off co-ops to saying they didn't want to subsidise through taxes the other republics. And this was part of the process which led to the secession of the republics from the Yugoslav Federation and to the breakup of the state. The other mechanism by which it occurred was through the banking system, in that the co-ops that were successful would have deposits with the banks, and the banks would lend money out to other co-ops. So co-ops which had run at a deficit would have to borrow from the banks and then pay interest to them, so that the banking system acted as a conduit by which covert surplus value could be extracted from one sector to the benefit of another.
Can you elaborate on labor credits? What is a general strategy on transition from a money to a labor credit economy? Can part be prepared previous to the revolution?
Not prior to holding state power, no. But on the other hand, it can be. You can go through a series of steps after a socialist government is established. In my view, an initial step would be to fix the value of whatever currency is already operating in the country in terms of the labour hour. At various stages you've had the currencies having their value fixed in terms of gold. Instead, you should follow a monetary policy of the state fixing value in terms of the labour hour. Now, Engels ridiculed the idea of Düring that this was something feasible. Düring was proposing labour money in the German Empire, and Engels ridiculed this on the grounds that if you issued Reichsmarks denominated in labour hours, it would fall under the anti-socialist law, because it would be an immediate propaganda for the overthrow of capitalism, because every worker could then see that they were being exploited by their employer. But if you've got a socialist government, that's not a bad thing, because making the form of the money demystified, revealing what the value of money really is in terms of labour hours, immediately exposes to everyone who's working how much they're being exploited. And you could easily then carry, with broad popular support, the demand that exploitation be abolished and all enterprises be transferred to worker ownership. So whilst it would be utopian to think this could be done before you had a socialist government, it is not utopian to say that it would form a propaganda technique after a socialist government came to power to win support for the general expropriation of the capitalist class. Because a socialist government might come to power with a relatively small majority initially, or not that broad level of let's say not a total support across the population. It's bound to be only a minority or small majority supporting it, and one of its chief goals has got to be to win over more support. And in China, this was done by winning support for the collectivization of land, by pointing out to the peasants how much they were being exploited by the landlords and how the collectivization of land would abolish that. And this is the analogy in a capitalist economy. You transfer the unit of the currency into the labour hour so that the hidden relationship of exploitation in the capitalist economy becomes evident, and the immediate way to deal with that then becomes obvious. Expropriate all the existing capitalists, hand over all the factories to the workers.
Somebody asks, wouldn't markets still exist due to the existence of different states and nations? And I would also like to know, does this presuppose that every other country is already also socialist?
No, certainly not. Certainly not. It's possible to do this in one or a group of countries. The foreign trade would have to be carried out on a different basis. You have to value. Okay, some things can't be produced domestically and have to be imported. What is the labour value of if you are in Poland and it's a socialist country? What's the labour value of oranges? Say, given that Poland can't grow oranges, the labour value of oranges has to be the number of hours of labour embodied in goods that have to be exported to an orange producing country, say Morocco, in return for the oranges you get. So that the trade still has to occur between states, because you can't have collective ownership of the means of production within a territory unless you can demand an equivalent exchange from other states. But whilst markets in the form of trade between states would still exist, the representation of that within the domestic economy takes the form of evaluating the products that are imported in terms of the labour that went into the products that were exported to obtain those.
Okay, you mentioned the use of syndicates, of cooperatives. Is there any difference between them and a state-owned company, or what is the role of like a socialist state-owned enterprises?
The big difference is how you think the socialist state should be funded. Okay? I think a big mistake of the Soviet state funding model was that it was based on the profits of state-owned enterprises. And this meant that the workers in the state-owned enterprises didn't receive the full value of their labour. They received only part of it, and another part of it went as the profit of the enterprise, and the state then appropriated the profit of the enterprise to fund the state. And this hides state funding. It becomes non-transparent, and it removes it from democratic control by the working class. The working class can't vote on this state funding because it depends on a mass of hidden relations of the level of profit in individual state enterprises. The level of profit in individual state enterprises depends in turn on state policies of prices. So the whole thing becomes obscure. And when you look at what Marx advocated, when on the two occasions that he actually wrote, or the three occasions that he talked about programs, he always assumes income tax as the basis of, or what amounts to an income tax. In the program of the French Socialist Party and in the Communist Manifesto, the demand is explicit for the funding of the state by income tax or by rent on state land. The other, when he's talking about the critique of the Gotha program, he talks about it in terms of deductions from wages. You've got to bear in mind that whilst most modern capitalist economies have a pay-as-you-earn system of income tax, that the income tax is deducted from a worker's wages before they ever get paid the wages. At the time Marx was writing, income taxes on the working class generally didn't exist. income taxes generally existed only on the propertied classes. So when he's talking about it being necessary that there will be a deduction from workers' wages to meet social costs, he's essentially talking about what later became pay-as-you-earn income tax schemes. But it's a visible deduction. It's a deduction that can be voted on, and it's a deduction from wages. And the important point about this is that if the wages are the full value of labour, then you have a realistic social costing system, which you never had in the Soviet Union, because wages were artificially low because the enterprises were earning a profit which went to the state. Therefore, the wages only represented a portion of the labour that was being performed by the workers, and costing in terms of those wages was an unrealistic basis for costing and led to economic inefficiencies. If you start off from co-ops, where the workers are receiving the full value of their labour, and then amalgamate these into syndicates and into great workers' associations that are planned, and the state revenue is obtained via an explicit deduction from wages to meet social costs, then the economic relations are transparent, and they also lead to greater efficiency.
I guess the Soviet argument would have been that the workers do receive the full value of their labor since they get the subsidized housing, the subsidized food, the healthcare, the education, and all that. But I suppose it's just basically much less direct than just giving them the labor credits and then slapping on the tax.
Well, it mystifies it. It appears that these things are free goods given by the state. Okay, they appear as free services, but in fact they're services that the working class has paid for by the surplus value that's taken off them in state-owned enterprises. And it hides the relation of surplus value. And it then opens up the class demanding, well, we want a bigger share of this surplus value to be held by the enterprises. And it then moves over to the system of when the whole state.
How does market socialism relate to the petty bourgeoisie? How, for example, would we get these pseudo-bourgeoisie people to commit to the system? They will always try to resist collectivization like we saw in the USSR and in China. Is there no way to get them in co-ops without force, or will we always have to deal with kulaks and such?
There'll be intense resistance by business owners of all sizes to this happening. There's less likely to be intense resistance by relatively small businesses who don't employ other people, because it's quite likely that if they amalgamate into a collective, that they collectively will do better than if they're operating as individual traders. So it depends on what the actual class position is. Anyone who is actually receiving surplus value is going to oppose it. But that's bound to be the case. Whatever form of socialism you establish, those who receive surplus value are going to oppose it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. What are some of the starting points you would recommend for people in the software engineering field for acquiring the skill set necessary to start working on simulated plant economies and applications concerned with simulated running thereof?
My view is any competent programmer should be able to do this kind of thing. What you need to familiarize yourself with is actually the literature on the problem itself. So you have to read Kantorovich. You have to read the translations of Kantorovich's work and start from there. Then you'll have a good idea what the problem is. Or, I mean, it also helps if you look at some of the more mathematical Marxist economists like Morishima.
If I wanted to figure out, let's say, how much I'm being exploited, is there any way that I could actually do that? Is the
Yes, I mean, what you set out, what you should do first is take the country you're in, Finland or whatever. Do you have the euro in Finland?
Yes.
Okay. Look at the Finnish national income statistics. Look at the total. If you look at the national accounts, you'll get the total payment to labour. You'll also be able to find the total profit of enterprise. You'll find the total interest payments, and you'll find total rent. All of those will appear in the national accounts. You certainly aggregate all of those as surplus value. But you then look at what is the total newly added value each year in Finland, which is going to be the wages, surplus value, wages plus surplus value, and you will have to make sure that you take into account capital depreciation over that period. Deduct capital depreciation from the profits. And that will give you the total value in euros that was created in Finland. You then look at how many workers there are in Finland and what is the average length of the working day in Finland. That will be available from your Ministry of Labour. I don't know what it's called in Finland, but there'll be a Ministry of Labour and it will publish those statistics. You then divide the number of euros newly added value each year in Finland with the number of workers times the average working week times the average number of weeks a year that workers work. So you'll get the total number of hours work that were put in the Finnish economy, let's say in 2019. And you then divide through the value added by the number of hours that were required to generate it. And you then get a value productivity of labour. Last time I did that for a euro economy was at least 10 years ago, and it was for France, and the figure was around 30 euros per hour were being created. So that a euro was about 2 minutes labour in France. You'd have to calculate what it is in Finland. You then compare that to the number of euros you're actually paid for an hour's labour, and you can see how much you're exploited. But any Marxist-Leninist should familiarise themselves with being able to handle statistics. You have to go and look at your national statistics. Lenin spent years going through Zemstvo statistics, detailed statistics of the income, land holdings, revenues, area by area in Russia to study the development of capitalism in Russia. This is a precondition for conjunctural analysis in a country. You have to be able to analyse the concrete levels of exploitation, the organic composition of capital, etc., in your domestic country, and you have to know how to use statistics to extract that information. It's not difficult to do, but it just requires you to put aside some time and familiarise yourself with your national statistical sources, which are different in every country.
What is your opinion of Michael Heinrich and the new Marx reading school of thought?
Oh, politically, it is a reaction, a West German reaction against against socialism. Basically, it's an attempt to create a Marxism that doesn't bear the discredit that there exists in West Germany of being associated with actual communism. So it's an attempt to have a new reading of Marx that isolates him from actual socialism. And when you actually come down to it, it has no program. It has no program for transforming the economy. And One of the reasons it has no program for transforming an economy is that its basic theory of value is too narrow in its historical concept. They think that value only exists in capitalist economies. They think that abstract labour only exists in capitalist economies. And therefore, when they try and think about socialism, they talk about it in the most idealist way, the abolition of abstract labour. I mean, there's nothing about abolition of abstract labour in Marx. This is entire fantasy. And once you talk about that, you can't actually make any program for how you run a socialist economy, because as soon as you start saying the types of things Engels talks about calculating things in terms of labour time, or Marx talks about that, this is, that's just the value form again. You can't have that. So it's a dead end. It's a complete dead end. It's an attempt to establish a socialism that doesn't bear what is in West Germany the disreputable associations of East German socialism. None of these questions are appearing on my screen. I'm not sure where I should be looking.
If you go in the lecture chat, you can see them.
Okay, lecture chat. Okay. Yes, I'm looking in the wrong thing. Why is about the emphasis on the GDP? Well, you have to learn how to read national economic statistics, and when you analyze GDP figures, you can do it with various degrees of sophistication in Marxist terms. If you want a good guide to how to do it, Sheikh and Tonak's book on national statistics. I'd have to check. I've forgotten the Measuring the Wealth of Nations, I think it's called. So I would say use that, Sheikh and Tonak, as a guide to how you should analyse national statistics. I was giving you a very quick, crude account. We wrote, sorry, when I say we, I mean the people who have contributed towards a new socialism and the other publications that I'm associated with. Many of us were in a group in Britain in the 1970s called Communist Formation, and we did a lot of analysis of the British economy in terms, Marxist economic terms, back in the 1970s. So many of the methods that we were developing then are brought out more in Sheikh and Tonak's book in the 90s. So I suggest you get Sheikh and Tonak. On Scottish independence, I'm a member of Solidarity, which is a socialist pro-independence party. Before that, I was in the Workers' Party of Scotland, which was also a socialist pro-independence party. It was a Workers' Party of Scotland came out of the pro-Chinese wing of the socialist movement. The Solidarity is a result of a fusion of both Maoists and Trotskyists and people who are none of these, but who are pro-socialist and pro-independence. How long should a transition period of market socialism last, or until what criteria are met? Basically, you have to move as fast as possible. This was a good piece of advice by Oscar Lange in the 1930s, that unless a socialist government moved as fast as possible to bring about the complete expropriation of the capitalist class, it would become socialist in name only. So you should aim to bring about a socialist government should aim very quickly to bring about the conditions for expropriation. They should very quickly shift to a monetary policy based on labour units, and as soon as possible, maybe a year or two after that, hold a referendum on the general abolition of exploitation. Tips for people trying to get into your work or considering reading your book? Well, read Towards a New Socialism first, and then read the polemics we wrote against Hayek and Mises and people like that. I don't know enough about Zhush and Albanian self-reliance to comment on the last question. Has a market socialism, a transitionary stage, ever been applied in practice? Well, in a sense, yes. That's what the NEP was. It was a concession to market socialism, and it was viewed as a temporary transition. And then once they had enough sufficient development, they moved to a planned economy and expropriated the bourgeoisie. Same thing happened much more slowly in China, in that they had what amounted to a market socialist economy until the Cultural Revolution. They had planning before that, but they had still retained privately owned enterprises, which weren't expropriated until about 1967-68. That, to my mind, that was too long, but they were starting off with a much less developed economy. Is social democracy somewhat resemble market socialism? There are different variants of social democracy. Very few of them really are market socialist. The Swedish social democracy, if they'd gone ahead with the Meidner plan, would have been market socialist. But they didn't put the Meidner plan into practice. The programme of the mid-1970s Labour government in Britain was coming close to being market socialist, but it was more heavily state socialist than anything in Sweden, in that they had the state ownership of industry was extreme, had reached a very high level in Britain by the mid-1970s, and state ownership of housing, for example, had reached more than half of all housing. So the British model of social democracy was state-owned, but the state enterprises obviously produce commodities for a market. So in a sense it was market socialist. Should you set up cooperatives now? Well, I mean, setting up cooperatives, if it can be done, is a good step, but it is quite wrong to think that anywhere has ever been a basis for a transition to socialism. The cooperative movement can be a wing of the labour movement, but it's no more than a wing of the labour movement, and the aim of the labour movement is to take political power, and by the use of political power and control of the monetary system and the legislative power, to abolish the private ownership of the means of production. Yeah, you actually have to make, as Marx says, despotic inroads into the rights of private property. In what sense is China a mixed economy? It's a mixed economy in the same sense that Britain was a mixed economy, or France was a mixed economy in the 1960s. Large state sector, large private sector, with the balance of power between the two tending to fluctuate over time. Why do the majority of working class voters in Britain vote Tory in the last election? That's because the Labour Party followed a batshit crazy policy of trying to overturn a referendum in which a majority of working class voters had voted to leave the EU, and they alienated their base by doing this. I couldn't answer these questions about Wolf.
You answered the important part.
Well, in the 1960s and 70s, wasn't the UK still capitalist? UK, it was capitalism in its death throes. It was capitalism in which the share of national income going to profit had been forced really low by a powerful working class. It was going through a profit squeeze because of the power of the working class. And if you look at in detail at the accumulation of capital in the social democratic period, accumulation of means of production was very rapid. And this led to a depressing effect on the rate of profit. The full employment that was maintained meant that workers could easily gain higher wages. I remember during the 1970s when we had strikes, the employers always seemed to concede them, and you actually had the state having to introduce incomes policies which were highly egalitarian. They would, and even a conservative government in the 1970s was having to introduce incomes policies that introduced flat rate wage increases for everyone. Not percentage wage increases, but a flat rate wage increase. Everyone got the same £2 a week increase, whatever your job was. So those are things which don't occur in a market economy. They only occur in an economy where the power of the working class is very strong. And it's a crisis situation. Could either move towards a full socialist economy, or you had to have a counter movement back towards capitalism. But the point is that when you get a mixed economy and you get a crisis, it has to be resolved some way, and it can be resolved by moving further towards socialism or further towards capitalism. But the intense mixture becomes unstable. Do I see Labour splitting due to the Corbyn purge? I'm not in the Labour Party, so I'm not party to the debates that are taking place.
Something that I hear quite often is this idea that the capitalist market economy is some kind of very natural thing that just happens automatically, doesn't require any kind of bureaucracy. What would you say to that? That's planning is basically unnatural, requires lots of bureaucrats and stuff like that, whereas the market is just automatic and somehow self-correcting.
Well, take pictures. Go and look at historical pictures of the skyline of Moscow compared to the skyline of New York. How many office buildings were there in Moscow? How many office buildings in New York? The capitalist economy requires a much bigger bureaucracy, except that the bureaucrats are privately employed, and they don't call them bureaucrats.
Right.
But they are bureaucrats. They call them financial workers or what have you.
Every enterprise has every capitalist corporation has its own bureaucracy instead of...
It has its own bureaucracy, and then there's the financial bureaucracy. The share of the workforce during doing bureaucratic tasks is much higher under capitalism. Do you see the marginalisation of the electoral left will be an advantage to people of our position in the long term? Not really, no. I don't think so. I mean, I think a strong electoral left actually helps the position of people, of communists. The influence of the Communist Party is likely, or Communist parties tends to be greater when social democracy is strong than when social democracy is crushed. What's my definition of socialism? Socialism is a historically existing movement, and it has had various strands within it. There are strands which have advocated cooperatives, which were the syndicalists were most obvious, but there are strands which have... The dominant strand in socialism has advocated public ownership of the means of production, and in that sense, the most important feature of a socialist economy is most of the means of production are either publicly owned or at least out of the ownership of private capitalists. So if they're all owned by workers' cooperatives, that's a form of a socialist economy. If a majority of them are owned by the state and private capitalists is reduced to a small sector, that's also, I would say, a socialist economy.
Yeah, I think these types of questions about definitions, people try to find some quote from Marx or Lenin where they define what socialism is, but they always say it in a certain context. They say socialism is this, socialism is that.
Well, Marx never defined socialism. Other than people he wants to argue against are socialists. But
I think it's mainly when he says about LaSalle that in socialism there's no exchange or something, and it's a negative definition, but people still they want it.
He doesn't even say that. He said Marx is careful always to talk about communism. Socialism comes from Proudhon, LaSalle, and people like that, not from Marx.